Great. So thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Luther Clark. I'm the Deputy Chief Patient Officer at Merck, and I will be moderating this breakout session. So I'd like to welcome you and look forward to your comments. Now, before we get into the actual discussion, I'd like to start by asking each of you to identify yourself briefly with your affiliation. That will really help the staff in terms of gathering the comments. And I will call out the names based on how I see them on my screen here. So why don't we start with you, Lynn?
Lynn Matresian, I'm the Chief Science Officer at the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network.
Great. Susan Schaefer.
I'm Susan Schaefer. I'm the founder and CEO of the Patients Academy for Research Advocacy.
Okay. Emma Buckus. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too much. Emma.
It's fine. Hi, I'm Nicola Emma Buckus. I'm the editor-in-chief of the medical journal Med from Cell Press.
Hannah, how are you, Hannah? Hello.
Hi, I was at another group. I just immediately got transferred. I don't know why, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome.
I'm Hannah Valentine. I'm professor of medicine, cardiovascular at Stanford University, and recently retired as the chief officer for scientific workforce diversity at NIH.
Let's say we were promoted, Hannah.
Mark.
Yeah, Mark Unruh, Chair of Medicine at the University of New Mexico.
Okay, Marilyn.
Hi, Marilyn Metcalf, Senior Director of Patient Engagement at GSK, GlaxoSmithKline.
Great, and Marilyn will be speaking in the second session. I see, it says Carolyn, but let's see, Carolyn Simpkins?
Yes, hi, I'm Carolyn Simpkins. I'm an internal medicine physician. I work currently for Hive Networks, which builds software and systems for standing up learning health networks.
Great. Mandy? I think Mandy's on mute. Mandy and Enrique?
Yes, my name is Mandy Enriquez, and I work for the National Academies of Sciences as their AV technician.
Great. Deborah Bowers? Okay.
I'm doing the transcript for the meeting.
Great. Okay. Lana?
Hi, Lana Skirball, Vice President for Science Policy at Sanofi.
Okay, great. I see Carolyn. Carolyn, introduce yourself again. Okay, Carolyn.
Carolyn Shore. I direct the Forum on Drug Discovery, Development, and Translation at the National Academies.
And let's see, Shonda. Did I miss anyone? Okay, great. Well, welcome, team. We actually have two questions to address, and we'll divide them into roughly 15 minutes each. The first question, and I would remind you, as Esther mentioned, that we'd really like to focus on achievable goals to enhance person-centeredness and inclusivity in the clinical prize enterprise. So our first question that we'll spend the first 15 minutes on is, what do you see as 1 to 2 short-term, tangible, and measurable goals to ensure a more person-centered and inclusive clinical trials enterprise that should be met within the next 5 years? So we're asked to come up as a group with 1 to 2, and some of the specific aspects of that would be, what actions need to be taken to achieve the short-term goals? How should progress toward these goals be measured over time? And which stakeholders need to take action to make progress toward these short-term goals? And we've certainly gotten a great start with the discussion this morning. So who would like to start?
Could I ask, are we doing a report out?
There will be no report out today. For those of you who were in the first session a couple of weeks ago, there were report outs, but there will not be report outs of our group today. But you can certainly start Mark, in terms of responding.
Oh, no, I'll defer to, I think Lynn had her hand up.
Okay. Oh, great. Yeah, so you can raise your hand and I'll see you. And if I miss you, just start talking. Lynn.
Yeah, well, so in cancer clinical trials, there's always you can always be reported, in essence, the amount, the number of individuals that are enrolled, the percent of individuals that are enrolled in the trial that are of different ethnic backgrounds. And so an easy thing in that, in terms of looking for a metric, is to simply say we want a 10%, a 20%, a whatever percent increase in that percent over the next, it can ramp up over the next 5 years. And then you develop the strategies that you need in order to achieve that within the trials. Clearly, this is something that, any NIH funded trial or something like that is a metric that's looked at and is relatively easy to measure. It's just actually making a change is where we have to put the effort.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing you need targets, you need to measure them, and I would assume that it would be good to sort of track that with time, not just at the end when you're done. Great. Okay, great start.
If I could just add to that comment, sure. I think we need to figure out what percentages we're talking about for representation and be more precise than we have done. And I would suggest we consider having the representation reflect the prevalence of the disease in a particular population. So, African Americans are 13% of the population, and yet they're making up 25% of COVID-19 cases. So that kind of thing. So we look at the disease, look at the prevalence, and that's our goal.
So the goal would be prevalence. Would you, and you mentioned the burden. I mean, the burden. Mm-hmm. So the burden of disease would influence that as well. Okay, great. Others?
I guess for me, I face challenges kind of related to being in New Mexico of urbanness and ruralness, mm-hmm. In that, we want to provide the opportunity for all people in New Mexico to participate in trials, and yet reaching rural and frontier areas in a scalable way is a challenge. And that becomes particularly important when there's race and ethnicity overlapped with where folks live. For example, in New Mexico, the Pueblos are a challenge to include in trials.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. And often one of the questions that comes up, and I know a number of you have been working on this, is the workforce that's involved in doing the trials. And I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about that or how we might strengthen, that workforce so that in fact those goals could be achieved.
I get, for our current work, within the Pueblos, we've engaged community health workers to liaise with the clinical trials infrastructure. And we've had, some positive results using that approach.
Okay. Other comments? Yes, Marilyn.
This may be more a question than a comment, but a suggestion if we're not already doing it. Where are we in terms of recruitment into medical schools and other healthcare training programs in terms of both our diversity and our education around clinical trials and how they work, their value as medical research as part of contributing to overall better health and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to take that on? Well, not enough for sure, but well, one of the issues I think that was raised earlier in the Fireside chat had to do with there's the academic investigators, and then there are the community investigators or sites, and how to how do we think of those? Should we think of them, differently, both? I know in COVID, I believe it was mentioned that, the patients were not in the academic sites. They were out in the community. So we need to think both there. But how do we think about this? Hannah, you were at the NIH, and I'm sure you thought about this a great deal. So what can we do in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think that funders should absolutely insist that when they create these networks, that the community physicians are named as a PI and get the appropriate funding so that it doesn't all go to the academic center. A leading, a very senior program officer at NCI just before I left connected with me to say that they had, given up with their attempts to get PIs in their networks who were from underrepresented groups because they tried and failed. And I said, why are you giving up? What is your requirement? Do you have it that, that when these grants come in, they have to have co-PIs and the co-PIs should be from those groups, from the community group? And he said, my God, I hadn't thought about it. And when you do that, you begin to see it. And so it should be a requirement, I think.
Yeah, and I think the question that you raised, Hannah, is, the incentives for the community investigators as opposed to the academic ones who, being PI, writing papers, being on steering committees, are there the same considerations for the community investigators in addition to being named as PIs as well?
Yeah, it's not just the naming, it's that they get the resources to do this as co-PIs.
Could I ask, just would it be like a reasonable 5-year goal be to kind of go beyond race and ethnicity and kind of collect social determinants of health data in trials? Because I think that would kind of get at, like, what is it about being rural that's different, and is everyone who's rural having the same scarcity of opportunities and access?
Mm-hmm. So collect and use the social determinants data to inform what the sites, patient attributes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's great. I won't ask which ones do you think should be collected unless you would like to respond. That's a really key issue, because I'm not sure which are already being done. Are there top ones that we should start with? Because I think that's a great idea to collect and use social determinants data in our decision making. Okay.
I think I would really support that in order to get the full picture of what's going on and to get the most from the clinical trials. I think we need both. Very often you'll see the clinical trials are now dipping quite deeply into the genetic and the biological directions. And I think to get a full picture of understanding of the disease that would support the science, we need to also to have the parallel work on the same data set being done that involves the social determinants. I completely agree with that, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So how much of that can be done without an extensive questionnaire? How much of it has to be patient reported? And are we willing to go that extra step and use, all that marketing and internet stuff that that we heard about earlier, right? That everybody's collecting that information on us. Are we willing to take that step and get into that realm to get detailed information without the extra burden on the patient to fill out an extensive questionnaire that is really, I think, what we would need in order to get the information that we want? I find that that requires some thought as to where we would draw that line and how we would do that.
It does. It depends on how individual we want that data to be, because you could use epidemiological data and other real world types of data to look at things like communities where there are food deserts, for example. And so you can hypothesize you're going to have nutritional issues in those areas. And if you're recruiting from those areas, you're going to have to take that into account. And we should be, both looking at those areas and looking at ways to raise those nutritional goals and opportunities as we're working towards them. I was also thinking about the fact that when you're looking at more local centers, some of the new therapies, for example, in oncology, really can only be done in specialty centers based on the technical requirements. And so we do need to find some opportunities to bring communities and community physicians somehow into that, into those trials. And I don't know if that means locally or if that means making sure that some follow-up can still be done in local communities so that there is a translation and making sure that that care is more available. But I do think we have to think about those pragmatic constraints as well and how to get around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are two really great points. Let me just to capture. So Lynn, I think your point, we're hearing that it's important to collect information around social determinants, but I think your plea is that we do it in a way that does not create additional burden for the patient. So we don't want to make it more burdensome, but we'd like to make it less so if possible. And then the involvement of the community, of course, could help with all of this. Great. Okay.
Can I just ask one question? So a lot of this is in the electronic medical record, presumably. And of course, the organization of electronic medical records is fraught with difficulty, but I think it's a challenge that we must face. There's Medicare data, there's all kinds of things in there that the kinds of things that will be helpful in this research.
Right. You may be leading us to our next question, but I see Carolyn's hand up. Carolyn, you want to?
We have a question from the chat related to something that Marilyn had mentioned. The question is, how do you propose supporting clinicians and providers who are in the community and themselves reflected of the patient diversity that you're seeking to enroll in trials? So these are providers who may have patient populations, but maybe not the infrastructure and training to be clinical investigators.
Yeah, that's a great point. So why don't we take that question and then we'll move to what I think this may transition. So who would like to take that on? How do you compensate? There's time, there's effort. How do you incentivize? Hannah mentioned making them PIs, not just in title, but in terms of their participation in the study. Are there other things we should be doing if we'd like to, increase participation of primary care providers, family doctors? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I guess, at the University of New Mexico, we have this program called Project ECHO that creates a network of primary care providers. And one could imagine using something like an ECHO framework to train people up. The other thing I think that ECHO does really well is that it tries to compensate these clinics for their participation in Project ECHO, such that there'll be support for the community health worker in the clinic to help set things up. And that's been very, very successful, actually.
Anything else?
There's networks in the cancer area, cancer research networks, the one that I was referring to earlier. And you can imagine layering on what they have currently with a very strong educational programs that will actually build the pipeline, not just for physicians, but nurses and other kinds that are part of this research team.
Right. So building those research teams, supporting them, but also providing studies to them so that you don't create or train sites and investigators and not have studies available. So we have about 10 more minutes, and I'd like to shift to our second question, which is really a build on what we've been discussing. So what technologies, tools, or techniques could be transformational to improving inclusiveness and equity in the clinical trial enterprise over the next 5 years? So which are the ones?
Well, we already were prompted by one, simpler more straightforward, less cumbersome consent forms.
Okay.
And to that, you can imagine, handheld devices that people use with apps on them, on phones, that they can enter the clinical trial, do the survey that is required, be prompted for their visits, all those kinds of things. I think are actually getting into standard practices now, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a simplified consent form would certainly help. More digital, remote. Is there? I mean, would that make things better or worse? I mean, is there a digital divide that we need to be concerned about, or not?
Yeah,
so Lynn, I see you're about to speak.
Yeah.
There is a digital divide that has become apparent in the COVID-19 as it affects students, and the inconsistency of internet access and all of that. So you can see now we're moving into really large scale and important, national issues that need to be addressed. But I think we must say these things in our recommendations, and, then the powers that be will figure out how to get it done.
So it's important that we do it. It does create perhaps a barrier for some that needs to be overcome. So
yeah.
We should not do that. I think some of you on this call are the powers that be.
Not anymore.
Okay. Others.
Yeah, it seems to me that, again, moving towards being able to gather more from the electronic health records, being able to have control groups that are kind of standard of care. This is what's happening in the field now, versus an intervention, using, in essence, we just designed a study with a post-randomization consent so that we're only consenting those that are getting intervention. And our control is really just following electronic health records with a waiver of consent to see what's happening normally in the field. And so I'm hoping that kind of approach will be the type of thing that will get us farther iteratively. So I don't know if it's transformational, but I think it will increase the pace of making changes within the field.
Right. Also, Lynn, I think the point you made earlier at the beginning of this discussion in terms of identifying important and measurable targets and tracking those, that might lend itself to a digital capability as well. Others, any particular metrics or outcomes that would lend itself here that you'd like to put on our list? So who would be the stakeholders that would be key in making this happen?
Well, patients, clearly. I mean, certainly having choices available is something that I get feedback on a lot from patients around, not everybody is going to want this presented in the same way, or some will want to use an app and some won't. And so are there, different ways that people can fill out the same information. And so I think flexibility is a real key, as well as understanding the patient population in the first place. But even within that population, there's always going to be some diversity of preferences and just, as you say, how strong your internet access is and, any number of other variables. So I think trying to make sure that we don't increase that digital divide by requiring that everyone has to have exactly the same capabilities at home, that we provide some kind of alternatives through, I don't know, take-home devices or different ways of, as we said earlier, involving community providers as well for some of your follow-up visits so that you're not constantly having to travel as much or to have the same transportation and internet and so forth capabilities, that we offer a broad range of alternatives where we can, while still, of course, keeping the data consistent, but finding more creative ways to allow patients to participate.
Mm-hmm. Right. And certainly COVID amplified the importance of digital, virtual, remote. Any learnings there that can help us in terms of identifying or deciding? We had some discussion of that in the fireside chat, but what about learnings from COVID in terms of how we think about this?
Well, the clinical trial accrual was amazing. I mean, it was just amazing, right? In terms of, if you compare it to at least most of the trials I'm aware of, the speed, the reach of that, it was pretty amazing. The bottom line is it can be done, and it ought to make us all embarrassed that it took something like that to show us. But yeah, let's not lose that opportunity. Let's, take advantage of that and take that, set that up as the standard. Can we get close to that kind of speed with our advances by using some of the approaches that they used, which was getting into the community, using remote techniques rather than always having to come into the clinic. That type of thing seems to me that it's a real opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there were a couple of points that were made in the far side. One, that the community was brought in late, it seemed, and at least in some of the studies, but it was then made a priority. So patient and community involvement, once it was prioritized and focused on, there were some successes that are there. Other thoughts?
Well, the sponsors are key here, right? They're a key stakeholder as well. So whether it be pharma or government or advocacy or, whoever the sponsors are. Making sure that there's carrots and or sticks that incentivize. What's the right balance between carrots and sticks and how they're implemented needs some thought, but clearly those are tools that can be used to help change the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Institutions, the academic institutions, the health systems are also stakeholders. They hold a lot of power and influence and money. And to the extent that we engage with the health systems, it might be helpful to have this research really part of their missions.
Mm-hmm. So linking the centers, care, maybe the academic centers with the communities. Okay, great.
And the health systems.
And the health systems.
Bigger entities out there.
Okay.
So another question from the public chat, sort of related to this topic. So involving community clinics and trials or any protocol-driven research is very disruptive for clinical workflow. So the question is, how would you train and compensate them? So what action items would need to happen within the next 5 years in order to support that kind of community level engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
I think what has been the problem in the past is that we put the clinical trial out there and not provided any resources for the extra work that needs to happen. When clinical trials come along, the amount of support per patient enroll hardly ever covers the cost. So really what we need to do is firstly, more appropriate compensation. Secondly, have staff that are dedicated to this work, but integrated within the clinic or the practice or whatever that are there in addition to the usual staff. And that way the research part can flow a little bit more seamlessly than be disruptive. But I think the core issue is this underfunding. Personally, in my own research, that I face that all the time. You know, they give you a measly $2,000 per patient and expect you to do all this kind of stuff, and it doesn't work.
Particularly if you're trying to kind of make sure that your work kind of fits within the flow of a clinic. Yeah. I guess I would also focus on the positives. I think that, you know, if you can engage, for example, I mean, I'm most familiar with rural physicians who are largely kind of out there alone. I think if you engage them in research, it can create a community for those physicians and help retain them. And we also know that patients that participate in trials tend to be more satisfied with their experience. So while it's a challenge for a system or a clinic, I think that there are positives. I think, you know, we've kind of raised healthcare systems as a key stakeholder, and I think you can kind of cascade that down to even just the clinic infrastructure and making sure that they're a part of the stakeholder group and that you can do the work that you need to do without being too disruptive.
Well, I've been notified that we will be sent back to the main room in less than a minute, but I think that's a great point. The question is, how do you do that? So these community practices are clinical based, so there's an opportunity there, but there are also some issues that need to be addressed, such as the resources, the staff, the time, and how do you integrate this into their day-to-day work without compromising the care of their patients. Okay, well, we can continue talking until we suddenly shift back, but that's great. Any final comments that anyone would like to make that's under? Yes, Susan.
So what Mark just said, and it also came up in, I believe it was Megan's comments in the fireside chat, this idea of focusing on the positives. I think that one thing that could really help move this forward, because, you know, many of us have been talking about these concepts for many, many years now. And I think one of the things that can make adoption more difficult is that there isn't a lot of data on the positives. There aren't a lot of detailed and compelling examples that are published or otherwise put in the public domain about the benefits to different stakeholders of engaging more members of the community in a more inclusive way. We hear things like it disrupts the clinical flow. We hear things like Megan said, it slows things down. And we don't have enough in the public domain about cases where there have been increases in enrollment and better quality data and you know, diversity that more reflects the population we hope to treat. I don't know what we do about that. So much of this work is done in, you know, sort of in a competitive fashion, and there's a need to keep confidential for IP reasons and other reasons. But I think that some concerted effort toward making more publicly available data on the benefits could really move this forward in a much more meaningful way. And maybe COVID is one of the examples that we can look to find some of those data.
So focusing on the positive, the benefits of addressing these issues and not only on the difficulties and the barriers.